Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire is required for peace in Afghanistan. His remarks follow a US airstrike targeting Taliban fighters in Afghanistan days after the signing of the Doha peace deal. More in this report.
The signing of the Doha peace deal was seen around the world as a chance for lasting peace in Afghanistan. But the Taliban and Afghan troops resumed fighting after Afghan President Ashraf Ghani refused to free Taliban detainees under the deal. Washington said today's strike was a defensive move to disrupt Taliban attacks on a checkpoint in Helmand province.
Comanche X-ray, Comanche 9.
In nearby Pakistan, Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi urged all parties to remain committed to peace.
There is no military solution in Afghanistan. For 19 years, you have projected your military power there, wasting money and resources.
Earlier, US President Donald Trump said the Afghan Taliban have agreed on no violence in the region during a phone call. Trump told reporters he had a very good conversation with Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar.
We don't want violence. We'll see what happens. They're dealing with Afghanistan, but we'll see what happens.
Okay? Do you believe this is a pandemic, sir? Is this a
We had actually a very good talk with the leader of the Taliban.
The UN says over 10,000 civilians were killed or injured in Afghanistan last year. This was the 6th year in a row that the number of casualties have exceeded this number.
In a related development, Afghanistan's presidential palace says Qatar has offered its assistance to facilitate the intra-Afghan talks. In a statement, the palace said Amir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani called Afghan President Ashraf Ghani to discuss the Doha deal. It said during the phone call, the two leaders discussed the implementation of the US-Taliban agreement and intra-Afghan talks. The palace said Al Thani said both Kabul and the Taliban have to sort out their differences to form an inclusive government. It said Ghani thanked Sheikh Tamim and asserted he is open to further discussions about peace. For more on this, we are joined by Rahimullah Yusufzai, an Afghan expert from Peshawar, Pakistan. Thank you for your time. Despite the US President Donald Trump's call to Taliban leaders in order to achieve peace in Afghanistan after the Doha deal, the US has hit the Taliban fighters in Helmand. Do you think this strike can disrupt intra-Afghan talks?
I don't think this is going to disrupt the peace agreement or the proposed intra-Afghan dialogue. I think it has raised concerns whether this reduction in violence understanding can be sustained because the Taliban yesterday, when they resumed attacks against the Afghan government forces, had also announced that they would not attack the US and its allied forces. But now the US has carried out the airstrike against Taliban fighters in Helmand. That actually can provoke the Taliban to maybe also start attacking the US-led NATO forces. That could create problems. But I believe the US also had to take some action to reassure the Afghan government that it is standing by it. It will not abandon it, because Taliban had carried out a number of attacks against the Afghan forces and killed about 20 soldiers and policemen. So the US had to act. But we still don't know how many Taliban fighters have been killed in this US airstrike, whether it was symbolic or whether it was really a very big attack causing casualties among Taliban.
Mr. Yusufzai, both President Ghani and Abdullah have claimed victory in the presidential election. What political formula could find a way through the complexity of this situation, and how do you see President Ghani's future?
I think that is a big problem now, and it has to be resolved as soon as possible, because Ashraf Ghani is going to take oath for his second term in office on March 9th. And on March 7th, I believe. So if it happens, he takes oath, then Abdullah also has threatened to hold a separate swearing-in ceremony and take oath as the president of a parallel administration, and that, will create two parallel administrations in Kabul. Then Taliban will say, who represents whom, who is going to talk on behalf of the anti-Taliban forces. So there has to be some sort of an understanding. At least, even if they don't accept each other's victory, they can agree on forming a joint inclusive delegation to talk to Taliban.
Mr. Yousafzai, what could happen if the intra-Afghan talks are unable to achieve consensus?
I think starting the talks is going to be a challenge. They're supposed to begin on March 10th, and by that time, the prisoners' exchange should have taken place. It's not happening yet, although we have heard reports that some of the Taliban prisoners, have been removed from their cells and their biometrics have taken place. So maybe they are preparing to release them. Also, the Taliban have agreed to meet an Afghan government delegation for the first time in Qatar to discuss the issue of prisoners. So these are hopeful signs, and I think that this could lead to the talks, but that will have to be postponed beyond March 10, because the process of releasing the prisoners must start by that time. But to make the talks a success, that will be a big challenge, because this is not going to be easy.
That was Rahimullah Yousafzai, Afghan expert from Peshawar, Pakistan. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate that. Moving on, European Union Ambassador Andrula Kaminara has lauded Pakistan's strong commitment regarding the Financial Action Task Force Action Plan. Kaminara was calling on Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi in Islamabad. In a statement, the Foreign Ministry said both discussed trade and political relations between Pakistan and the EU. The ministry said Kaminara offered technical facilitation to Pakistan regarding the action plan. The Foreign Ministry said Qureshi highlighted grave human rights violations by Indian forces in occupied Kashmir. It said Qureshi informed Kaminara about the Indian government's controversial Citizenship Amendment Act. Meanwhile, the Muslim community is still trying to recover after 3 days of violent pogroms that killed over 40 people last week. One Muslim couple has spent nearly a week outside a local morgue waiting to identify the body of the woman's father. More in this report.
Gulshan Nasiruddin's father disappeared last week when mobs of Hindu fanatics launched an assault on Muslims and their neighborhoods. All she's found of him is a single leg that she's been waiting for doctors to identify for a week. The only person she's had with her is her nearly blind husband.
My father's whole body was burnt and only one leg was recovered. So right now, the doctors are saying, how do we believe that it was your father? You can't recognize anything through just one leg. That's why, the day before yesterday, they took a sample for the DNA test, and only after the test, they will be able to establish something definitive.
The impoverished family has now lost its only breadwinner as a result of unfettered Hindu extremism. Such stories have sent a shockwave of fear throughout India, where Muslims say they no longer feel safe.
Whatever happened was wrong, and it should not have happened. Those people should get reformed, and there should be peace all around. It should not be like this, where we are all living a life of fear.
Many Muslim families have left their homes, leaving for cities with less religious tensions. Meanwhile, schools and businesses remain shut in New Delhi.
Due to the shutting down of shops, the businesses are closed. People have suffered losses. The children are not going to schools, and there are problems at people's homes, like milk or bread. So many people have problems.
This is not an isolated incident. Signs of rising Hindu-Muslim tensions have been growing since Prime Minister Narendra Modi took office in 2014. These include cow lynchings and hate-laden speeches by members of the ruling BJP and the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act. As such, India's so-called secular image now lies in tatters, along with the lives of thousands of its Muslim citizens.
Palestinians have staged protests in the occupied West Bank after Israeli bulldozers started cleaning the land. They fear it's an attempt to confiscate the area for future Jewish settlements. The scuffles intensified as Israeli voters went to the polls. Dozens of residents of Beita and Kusra villages held protests at two hilltops near Nablus, raising a Palestinian flag. The military said that Israeli settlers were carrying out agricultural work in the area. Villagers said Israeli forces fired tear gas and stun grenades at the protesters. Witnesses said Israeli soldiers detained some protesters. Protected by the army, 6 Israeli bulldozers worked on the land near the current settlement of Majdalim. The Saudi-led coalition fighting in Yemen says it has foiled an attack on an oil tanker of the country's coast. In a statement, coalition spokesman Turki al-Maliki said the tanker was sailing towards the Gulf of Aden when it was targeted by 4 boats. He said one of the unmanned vessels tried to explode it, but the statement did not say who was behind the attack. The coalition has in the past accused Yemen's Houthi movement of trying to attack vessels off the coast of Yemen with unmanned boats laden with explosives. Libya's eastern government of Khalifa Haftar has opened a diplomatic mission in Syria's capital Damascus. It is the first diplomatic representation of Libya in Damascus since 2012. The embassy was opened 2 days after the meeting between Syrian Foreign Minister Walid al-Muallam and Haftar's delegation in Damascus. At the opening ceremony, Syria's Deputy Foreign Minister Faisal Mekdad said it shows the two countries are facing a similar battle. Haftar's move in Syria came as tensions have spiraled between the Assad regime and Turkish forces in Idlib. The Libyan conflict escalated in 2014, splitting power between the two rival parties. After the Syrian war broke out in 2011, most Arab states closed their embassies in Damascus or reduced diplomatic representation. Turkey says 2 of its soldiers have been killed and 6 wounded in an attack by the Syrian government forces in Syria's Idlib province. The defense ministry said Turkish troops retaliated by striking Syrian military targets. Fighting in the northwestern Idlib province continues on the eve of talks between the presidents of Turkey and Russia. Earlier, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said he expects his talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin will result in the ceasefire in Idlib. Erdogan was speaking to reporters ahead of his visit to Moscow on Thursday. At least 59 Turkish soldiers have been killed in Idlib since Turkey began its military campaign in Syria. The clashes have forced nearly 1 million people to flee towards the Turkish border in search of safety. On Sunday, Turkey officially declared the state of a full-scale military operation against Syrian regime forces. It's time for a short break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back. In Greece, riot police have fired tear gas at hundreds of migrants trying to cross the border from Turkey. Turkish officials say 1 migrant was killed and 5 others wounded in the fighting. More in this report. Over 10,000 migrants have been trying to enter Europe since Turkey opened its borders last week amid tensions with Syria. Turkey, which already hosts some 3.7 million Syrian migrants, says it cannot handle another wave of refugees. This was followed by deadly clashes as Greece stopping at least 24,000 migrants from crossing the border from Turkey. Backed by the EU, Athens accuses Ankara of deliberately luring the migrants to cross into Greece. It also rejected Turkish claims that its forces have killed several migrants in the past few days. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell said the situation at the border is unacceptable. Speaking in Ankara, he promised an additional 170 million euros in aid for vulnerable groups in Syria. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says the migrant crisis could only be resolved if Europe supports its efforts in Syria. Amnesty International says Greece has been violating EU and international laws and putting human lives at risk by its measures to block the entry of migrants. In a statement, the rights group said people seeking asylum are once again being used as bargaining chips in a callous political game. Amnesty said Athens must refrain from using excessive force and those seeking asylum in Greece should be treated not as criminals. Meanwhile, the EU Commission said Greece is Europe's shield against illegal migrants. The Commission has pledged $780 million in financial aid for controlling migrants. Over 130,000 migrants have crossed to Europe after Turkey opened its borders, while accusing the EU of not fulfilling the promises it made. The United Nations has appealed for nearly $900 million to help thousands of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. The UN Refugee Agency and International Organization for Migration have launched a joint appeal for the cause. The UN said the money will address the needs of approximately 855,000 Rohingya refugees. The international body said the funds will also help over 444,000 vulnerable Bangladeshis in the communities hosting Rohingya refugees. It said the funds will cover food, shelter, sanitation, healthcare, education and protection services. Over 740,000 Rohingya Muslims fled to neighboring Bangladesh after Myanmar military launched a massacre in 2017. In the United States, former Vice President Joe Biden has won 9 of 14 states in the biggest day of the 2020 Democratic presidential race. Frontrunner Bernie Sanders has captured 3 states. Just days after his campaign was resurrected by a big win in South Carolina, Biden emerged as a consensus champion for the moderate wing of the party against Sanders. Biden told supporters in Los Angeles, "For those who have been knocked down and counted out, this is your campaign." Sanders, who had hoped to take a big step towards the nomination yesterday, won Colorado, Utah, and his home state of Vermont. Biden swept to wins in Alabama, Arkansas, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Virginia. It was a spectacular turn for Biden after poor showings in the first 2 contests in Iowa and New Hampshire. Amnesty International says Iranian security forces killed at least 23 children during nationwide protests in last November. In a report, the rights body said 22 boys aged between 12 and 17 and a girl aged between 8 and 12 were killed. Amnesty calls for an independent and impartial investigation into the killings. It says evidence was gathered from videos and photographs, death certificates, eyewitnesses, and victims' families. Saudi Arabia has temporarily stopped the Umrah pilgrimage along with visits to the Holy Prophet's mosque to contain the new coronavirus. The Interior Ministry says the Umrah pilgrimage has been suspended for Saudi nationals as well as residents. On Monday, Saudi Arabia confirmed the kingdom's first new coronavirus case. The next day, Saudi Arabia barred GCC citizens and residents from entering the kingdom for 14 days. Saudi state media announced that travelers coming from any Gulf state must spend 14 continuous days there. It said that travelers must show no signs of coronavirus before they are allowed to enter in the kingdom. Other GCC states have also diagnosed the infection in people who had visited Iran, totaling more than 145 cases. Italy's Civil Protection Agency has reported the deaths of another 27 people in the last 24 hours from the new coronavirus. The country's death toll is now at 79, the highest in the world outside China, with 38 new deaths brought its total toll to nearly 3,000. More in this report.
Up to now, 3,200 people from around the world have lost their lives because of the virus, which has further infected over 93,000 people in 70 countries. While the growth of the number of cases in the epicenter, China, has slowed, in Europe and the US, the number of infections has only grown. In Iran, another 11 people have died from the infection, taking their total to 77. South Korea has reported another 516 new coronavirus cases, bringing the country's total to over 5,000, with 32 deaths.
There are about 2,300 confirmed patients in Daegu who are awaiting hospital or treatment center admission. The government is deploying all possible resources across the government to increase the number of treatment centers for patients in Daegu who are waiting in their homes.
UK health officials have warned the new coronavirus has the potential to infect 80% of the British population. In the meantime, the number of deaths in the US has risen to 9, while the authorities have reported over 100 confirmed cases.
We've already made a decision on parts of Italy, and Japan is very unfortunate because I've seen the incredible job they did on the Olympics.
The World Bank has committed $12 billion in aid for developing countries grappling with the spread of the disease.
The WHO says there haven't been any new reported Ebola cases in DR Congo for 2 weeks. Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus says this is a positive sign for the whole world. Ghebreyesus' comments come a day after last Ebola patient in DRC was discharged. First detected in August 2018, the outbreak was concentrated in North Kivu and Ituri provinces. 2,200 Ebola-related deaths and 3,300 cases of infection have been reported since then. Progress in fighting the disease was also hindered by militancy in the region. This epidemic was preceded by another smaller outbreak in another part of the country. This is DRC's 10th Ebola outbreak since 1976. In Nigeria, 14 security personnel and civilians have been killed in a suspected Boko Haram attack on a military base in the northeastern state of Borno. Officials said 6 soldiers, 4 police officers and 2 members of the government-backed militia were killed along with 2 civilians. They said militants in trucks fitted with machine guns launched a raid on the army base in town of Damboa at dawn. An officer said 6 soldiers were wounded in the attack. He claimed 13 insurgents were killed by a fighter jet as they fled the area. The decade-long insurgency in Nigeria has killed 36,000 people and displaced 2 million others inside the country. The UN has warned of a surge in violence in the conflict zone in recent weeks. The European Commission has unveiled a climate law to meet the EU's 2050 net zero emissions target. But Swedish activist Greta Thunberg says more urgent action is needed to beat the climate crisis. At a meeting in Brussels, EC Chief Ursula von der Leyen approved the proposed regulation. The climate law would bind the 27-nation bloc to reduce its net greenhouse gas emissions to zero by 2050. The new law still needs the approval of the European Parliament and member states. But Greta Thunberg branded the EU's law inadequate, saying it doesn't take the damage that will be caused to the environment in immediate future. Once ratified, the law will also give the EU executive new powers to impose emission targets on member governments. 23 people have died in torrential rain that hit the Brazilian state of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Officials said constant rain has triggered flash floods and destroying homes. Officials said another 32 people are missing in Sao Paulo, raising fears the toll can rise further. Rescue officials said the victims were electrocuted, buried in landslides or drowned. They said violent storms in recent days have dumped a month's worth of rain on some areas. They said several highways are blocked by landslides, including some linking Santos, the biggest port in South America, to Sao Paulo. Hong Kongers are escaping the coronavirus anxiety by heading for the hills to find fresh air and space to exercise. Details in this report.
While the financial hub is known for soaring skyscrapers and cramped housing blocks, its steep mountains and remote hiking trails offer welcome relief from the COVID-19 fears, which triggered the closure of public facilities. Over the past weekends, long snaking lines of people have been seen on popular trails like Lion Rock and Dragon's Back.
I've been staying at home for too long. Going out hiking, I think everyone shares the same thought, that it is to breathe some fresh air, make ourselves comfortable, enjoy the breeze and the view, and to change feelings for the better.
However, the sudden increase of walkers has left a trail of rubbish behind, including surgical masks and hand wipes. Environmental group Greenpeace is urging people to hike without a trace.
I wore a face mask and alcohol hand rub when I left home. When I started hiking, as this trail is quite steep, my breathing becomes more difficult, so I took the mask off.
Some 101 patients have tested positive for the virus in Hong Kong, 2 of whom have died.
Louis Vuitton wrapped up Paris Fashion Week with a mixed up of retro chic, sporty and futuristic looks. The show was set to a Baroque soundtrack sung by a choir in costume. What in this report?
Plunged into darkness, the audience inside the Louvre's Cour Carrée gasped as the curtain rose to reveal a terrace backdrop with 200 singers and actors. The costumes these characters wore ranged in style from the 15th century to the 1950s. As for the collection, that too was filled with clashing historical references befitting the name Collisions of Time.
Fashion show that measures up to Louis Vuitton creative director Nicolas Casquier, who is a very, very, very good designer. It's very beautiful. He's faithful to his silhouettes, to the girls' personalities. It has a kind of freedom. It is very much like who he is, and it's very good.
Designer Nicolas Casquier said he wanted different eras to be confronted with another one, our own. This involved biker jackets with Baroque detailing and futuristic dresses with metallic ruffles alongside more familiar fabrics. The models carried Louis Vuitton's signature monogrammed bags.
I liked a lot the accessories and the shapes of the clothing, and I think it was a perfect mix between androgyn but also feminine.
This catwalk season has been disrupted by the fast-spreading coronavirus outbreak, which kept Chinese buyers and socialites from European events. French labels Agnes B and APC had to cancel their presentation in Paris, while in Milan, Giorgio Armani held its show behind closed doors.
It's time for a short break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Lows in the highs of the business world now. The International Monetary Fund says the coronavirus epidemic will slow global growth to below the 2.9% posted last year. Speaking in Washington, IMF chief Kristalina Georgieva says the epidemic poses a serious threat to people and the world economy. She called for a global response to the outbreak. The IMF chief said the international monetary body forecast growth of 3.3% on January 2020 and at least half point will be lost to the virus. Georgieva said they are determined to provide the necessary support to mitigate the virus's impact on the global economy. Earlier, the World Bank announced that it had $12 billion available to help the countries tackle the coronavirus threat. Wall Street stocks have jumped at open after former Vice President Joe Biden's strong performance in Super Tuesday primaries. Healthcare stocks also contributed to the overall boost. Shares of health insurers, United Health Group, Centene Corporation, Humana and Cigna Corporation surged. The indices of S&P 500, Nasdaq Composite and Dow Jones Industrial Average traded over 2% higher. European markets are trading higher with investors' confidence surging on the expected global stimulus measures pledged by central banks. London's FTSE 100 is trading 0.75% higher despite major stocks shedding value. Frankfurt's DAX has gained 0.75%. The CAC 40 in Paris is trading fractionally higher. In Asia, Seoul's Kospi gained over 2%. The Shanghai Composite also gained ground. Meanwhile, international Brent crude oil prices pared early gains, losing a fraction over fears of global recession. And now the weather situation from around the globe. That's all for now. With the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News. Thanks for watching.